In this series, I'll walk you through Ensoniq's classic advanced sampling recorder from 1992, otherwise known as the ASR. For the best experience, I recommend watching the clip on a larger display, such as a laptop, TV, etc. Put the clip in full screen mode by hitting F on your keyboard and set the resolution to 1080p via the settings widget down on the right of the frame. And that should help increase visibility for the smaller labels that I'll be referring to throughout the clip. Use the index markers across the timeline or in the description to skip directly to what you need to know. If you learn something new, hit like, share, and to stay informed of new upcoming episodes, subscribe and click the bell. Those that are feeling generous can tap the super thanks below to flow some support and help keep the lights on. And if you're on Instagram, drop by for a look at ToneLab. This particular episode intends to provide a basic overview of how to find your way around the ASR, what features and functions it's capable of, plus a few basics you can use to sample some sounds, record a few sequences, and save your work. Then, for those pursuing a deeper understanding, there'll be dedicated episodes where I dive deeper into each facet of the ASR, so check below for links to those. You should find this series suitable for the ASR keyboards and rack unit, some of which will also function similarly for the Ensoniq EPS operating systems too. If you're looking for sounds, there's ready-made kits you can download into your ASR, SP1200, MPC, etc., exclusively from ToneLab. You can see these in action also via the links below. The ASR came in a few various form factors: the 3U rack mount version, the ASR 88 full-length weighted key version, and this modest 61 key version, which is a solid 40 pounds or near 18 kilos, despite it being half the weight of the 88. Some of you may have spotted later models floating around with purple LCD displays, compared to my older one here with the vacuum fluorescent display, or VFD for short. Those weren't aftermarket custom add-ons, as some may presume, but actually a late run of ASR-10s that came off the production line with alternate displays, which I hear was due to the supplier no longer manufacturing VFDs for whatever reason. And unfortunately, these displays are not interchangeable with each other, which is a shame, as I wouldn't mind a purple LCD myself. But the good news is I recently found a supplier, which I'll leave a link to below, for those needing a replacement, as unfortunately the older displays do eventually expire. 5 years after the ASR debuted, Ensoniq famously released the ASR-X. Then a year later, the X Pro, which rather than keyboards are what you might describe as a desktop sampler. And these appeared to be marketed as an alternative to the MPC. However, the X and X Pro are vastly different animals compared with the original rack and keyboard versions. So for that matter, I don't think X users will have much to take away from this series. Out of the box, the ASR came standard with 2 MB of RAM/memory, upgradable to 16. There's an 8-track sequencer on board that can be utilised in such a way to offer 16 tracks, provided you don't mind using the first set of 8 instruments as your second. Sounds, referred to by the ASR as instruments, can be assembled using one or many samples with the advanced synthesizer-like engine that features Ensoniq's own transwave synthesis, which also appears in other products from Ensoniq. If you're not familiar with transwave synthesis, then it's probably best described as something not unlike wavetable synthesis, in that it allows you to modulate your loop points to create some interesting sounds that progress or evolve through the course of the samples being played. So whether you're creating simple drum-based tracks, or perhaps building complex layered textures that use controllers to modulate effects, the ASR can easily do both, and at the same time. It's quite the powerhouse of a synth or sampler. Whichever way you look at it, it excels as both. But with both combined, you can really do some amazing things. At the core, the ASR is a 16-bit 44.1 kHz stereo sampler, complete with MIDI sequencer along with 24-bit stereo effects processor, capable of direct-to-disk hard disk recording with the assistance of a third-party storage device, connected to the optional Small Computer Systems interface, also known as the SCSI port, located on the rear of the unit. Other connections include an optional digital in-out board, which provides the ability to record stereo digital audio at 44.1 or even 48K sources via the Sony Philips digital interface, otherwise referred to as SPDIF. And using the digital interface ultimately bypasses the ASR's analog to digital converters. But you can output songs, sequences and sounds via the digital output at 44.1 kHz to an external digital recorder, such as a DAT machine, hard disk recorder, or perhaps an audio interface, provided they too have a SPDIF interface. The output expander port is for use exclusively with the optional OEX 6SR output expansion module from Ensoniq. And what this does is provide 3 additional pairs of stereo outputs, referred throughout the ASR as AUX, which is an abbreviation for auxiliary. The thing to note about these is that they bypass the effects processor. So essentially the output expansion module is dry without effects. However, when combined with the main stereo output, you can route individual samples and instruments through any one of 4 stereo pairs, or a configuration of 8 mono outputs, or perhaps a combination of both. These can be a little difficult to find these days, but I've heard there's third-party imitations floating around, so I'll leave any details I have about them in the description below. But if you do find one, just remember always power down your ASR before connecting or disconnecting them. Next across, we have the common trio of MIDI connections, the MIDI output, input and through. The through port mirrors everything the MIDI input receives outwards, which is handy for daisy chaining other MIDI devices you may have in your studio. You can also sync to other MIDI devices using the MIDI input port. That is, if you intend to slave the ASR's sequencer to another MIDI device, which we'll touch on later. Alternatively, if you'd prefer to use the ASR as your main sequencer, otherwise known as the master or master clock, you could slave devices to the ASR's MIDI clock / sequencer, or just trigger them with notes recorded in the ASR sequencer. The optional foot switch jack supports a single or dual foot switch, such as the Ensoniq ASR-10. The right-hand switch will act as a sustain pedal, while the left side can be assigned to a few other functions. If you're using a single foot switch, the Edit Mode System Category Left Foot Switch option should be set off. The Patch Select Jack, also intended for use with a dual foot switch, mirrors the functionality of the patch select buttons here, allowing hands-free patch changes you can make with your feet. The pedal CV jack can be used as a volume pedal or as an alternative to the mod wheel. Connect a control voltage pedal, such as an Ensoniq CVP1, to perform sweeps while both hands are preoccupied. You've got a mic or line toggle switch, allowing you to accommodate and record from line level devices or directly from a microphone. With the switch up in the mic position, the ASR can accommodate signals from -11.5 dBV down to -43.5 dBV, depending which end of the dial your input level is targeting. With the switch down, in the line position, the ASR will accommodate signals from +15.5 dBV down to -16.5 dBV, again depending which end of the dial your input level is targeting. In basic terms, you'll probably want this set to line, unless you intend to plug a microphone directly into it, or distort incoming line level audio intentionally. Either way, use the input dial to boost or reduce your input gain, which you can gauge via the front panel's left and right LCDs here. You'll notice your input level lamps glow green when the ASR receives audio. If you see the red lamp glow, that'll register signals at -6 dB, so it's generally okay to meter some degree of red. You'll find more detail via the graphic VU meter when the ASR is poised to record. It can be a bit laggy, so just play your audio through a few times if you're trying to capture a rich level. The stereo inputs and outputs are unbalanced TS quarter-inch jacks. If only a single jack is connected to either output, then the ASR will output a mono signal. Finally, we have the AC power switch and connector. If you're planning on buying an ASR from another country, then I suggest checking with the seller about the voltage on the unit, as these did not come with universal power supplies. You may need a step converter to avoid blowing the fuse, or worse, your power supply unit. I've put some information in the description below about spare parts and accessories, a lot of which you can source from the good people at SYNTAUR.com. Fuses are generally the first things to blow, particularly SCSI fuses, which generally blow when SCSI devices are connected or disconnected while the power is on. So play it safe, always power down your ASR before connecting and disconnecting SCSI devices and or your output expander. So even now, with what little of the ASR we've covered, you may be getting a sense, with the right options installed, not only could you assemble a fully functional workstation, but one that's proven lucrative for so many artists, such as Timbaland, Wu-Tang Clan, Kanye West, among many others, some of which are still using them to this day. So now let's whip round the front panel. Starting from the left, there's a conveniently placed disc tray to put 3.5-inch floppy disks that you might use on a regular basis, such as operating system disks, sound disks, song disks, etc. The keyboards and rack model were factory shipped with 3.5-inch quad density floppy disk drives, like my one still has here, capable of storing up to 1.6 megabytes per disk. But as mentioned earlier, additional third-party SCSI storage devices are available to you. The ASR-10 requires the optional Ensoniq SP3 SCSI interface to be installed, which came standard in the rack and the 88. And in case you're wondering, you'll know if your ASR-10 has the SCSI option installed, as the SCSI install status is displayed each time you power on the ASR. We'll take a closer look at the pros and cons of various storage options later in the clip, which I suggest checking out because the wrong decision could severely impact the ASR's ability to function correctly, particularly when it comes down to hard disk recording, which first appeared with the advent of the version 2 operating system from Ensoniq. Having said that, you can achieve a similar result recording continuous audio into the internal memory using the RAM tracks feature. But as the ASR is limited to 16 megs of internal memory, which is also used to retain samples, sequences, etc., using a SCSI option allows continuous audio to be recorded for much, much longer. And to provide some perspective, a hi-fi sampling rate of 44.1 kHz in stereo would need about 10.5 meg of memory for 1 minute of audio. Or alternatively, a little more than 5 meg a minute in mono. With a SCSI option, you give the ASR the ability to record something for a lot longer, such as a vocal track or a guitar solo, etc., and over the length of your song. What's more, you could edit and bounce it down from 2 tracks to 1, then repeat that scenario many times over. Next to the disc tray, we have the master volume fader, which controls the volume out of the rear headphone and stereo output jacks. But this is also capable of generating MIDI volume data that you can record into the sequencer as automation, such as fade outs and fade ins. In addition to that, if you're sampling from the main outputs, Any changes to the master volume will also be recorded. So make sure this is all the way up if you intend to sample from the main output. To the right of that, we have the 3 main mode buttons. Consider these as your 3 fundamental modes of operation. All your time working on the ASR will be in any one of these 3 modes: load, command, or edit. So start from the left with the mode, followed by the category to the right. If you want to load something in particular, enable the load mode by pressing load, followed by the category or type of file you're wanting to load. For example, if you're wanting to load an instrument, press load, followed by the instrument button. I better insert a disk. Then the ASR will load the directory on the disk and display files relating to whichever category button you press. In my case, instruments. You'll see a category tag inside the display here, indicating the mode you're currently in. Load is flashing to indicate we're on the verge of loading something from disk. Plus the category you selected, which in my case is instruments, or INST for short. Once you've selected a category, you can browse or scroll through that category's pages using the data entry slider or arrow keys to scroll up and down through the directory. In the case of load, you can also arrow left or right for additional file information, such as size, which is displayed in blocks. If that doesn't mean a whole lot to you, 1 block equals about half a kilobyte. The available memory on the ASR is also displayed in blocks, but there's also a time read you can find just left of the main sample page. Once you've located an instrument, or perhaps some other command, hit the enter button to run the function. And in my case, loading an instrument, the ASR will prompt me to pick an instrument button, press any available instrument track 1 through 8. And you'll notice the loaded indicator glow a steady red, which means an instrument is loaded into that particular track, available for you to select and start playing, recording, or even editing. And you could potentially repeat this process another 7 times and/or quickly delete an instrument by holding down any instrument button while pressing cancel. Similarly, if you wanted to load a sequence or song, again, you'd start by hitting the load button, only this time hit the sequence song category button. Then the ASR will display the directory of sequences and songs on the disk, which you can then scroll through vertically using the data entry slider and/or vertical arrow keys. And we'll visit some more basic functions relating to loading and saving later in the clip. The next mode we have is command, which behaves in a similar manner, but with command. You're presented a list of various functional tasks related to whichever category button that follows. So, for example, pressing command followed by effects brings you to the list of commands pertaining to effect functions. Coincidentally, if you were to press command followed by instrument, then similarly, you're presented with a list of functions that you can browse that are instrument related that you might use in relation to your selected instrument. Using the arrow keys, you can scroll through the various pages of functions and find one you'd like to use. One thing I should point out, if you scroll through the commands, you'll probably find a save function of some sort. Unlike load, having its own dedicated button, save, copy, and delete functions for instruments, sequences, MIDI, and effects are located via the command mode under the relative category. If you're browsing a category and find a function you'd like to use, hit the Enter Yes button, and in my case, this will run the Save Instrument function, prompting me to provide a name for the currently selected instrument here with the yellow selected indicator. Now, in terms of naming, I could use the arrow keys and data entry slider to scroll through numbers, letters, and a limited set of characters to dial in a meaningful name for the selected instrument. Then finally enter again to run the function, or alternatively, hitting the yes or no button to confirm or abort the operation. And if I was in just about any other category, the save command would prompt me for a name there too, whether it be effects, your sequences and songs, or whichever instrument is selected, just like in this instance. There are a couple of exceptions to that rule though. Macros and the save global parameters function don't have file name provisions, as they're disk directory or folder specific. If you've customized an effect, hit Command followed by its category, hit Enter, dial in a meaningful name using the data entry slider and or arrow keys. When you're done, hit Enter, and if prompted to do so, confirm or abort the process with either the same duly labelled yes or no buttons. A trick accessing the Edit System category you might like to use is you can double-click the System MIDI button to alternate between the first System option or the first MIDI option, like this. The last operational mode we have is the Edit mode, which follows a similar progression to its neighbours. If I wanted to edit the currently selected instrument, I'd first hit Edit, followed by the Instrument category button, and browse the various edit functions that are relative to the category I selected, only this time using the left-right arrow keys. And this key combination of nominating the mode followed by the category and then scrolling through pages of functions to find various tools is how you traverse the majority of the ASR's functions. So if you're planning on spending a bit of time with your ASR, then you'll find yourself going through the mode and category steps quite a lot. And just so there's no confusion, once you've delegated a mode, you can switch freely between categories within the same mode of operation. If you look across at the keypad, you might be able to see there's another unique set of categories, most of which will look familiar to those experienced with synthesizers, and we'll come back to those in a moment. But between the load, command, and edit modes, each having their own categories, you can probably gather that there's quite a few pages, each containing various features and functions that are at your disposal. The good thing is, there's a few different methods available to locate these functions. One way is subsequent presses on the category button, which will advance you to the next page/function in whichever category. Once you've settled on a function, use the left-right arrow keys to cursor across the available fields, and using either your data entry slider or vertical arrow keys, you can modify the values. Additionally, you can navigate away to neighbouring pages by using the horizontal arrow keys, or even holding down a horizontal arrow, then pressing up or down to skip fields and page either direction, left or right. But for those with the quick hand, many functions can be accessed directly by dialing in a key combo, which I've placed a link to in the description below. So refer to that to look up functions you frequently need to use. The way these work is kind of like Street Fighter combos. They're literally a few button presses in quick succession, starting with the mode, then category, followed by the page's direct dial number via the keypad. So, for example, if you were to look up the direct dial ID for the Save Instrument command, you'd find it's number 3. Therefore, the key combo for Save Instrument would be Command, Instrument, and number 3 via the keypad, like this. If you're planning on spending a day or so in front of your ASR, it might save you some time and possibly your fingertips knowing a few of these frequently used page IDs, as some of these categories contain up to 14 pages, which is a few to get through if you're browsing them one at a time, or worse, field by field. So now that we've run through how categories relate to modes, I'll just point out that any mode and category you're in will be reflected here in the display, which is also handy if you get lost in the ASR. Load, however, will flash while you're browsing for files, but remains solid throughout normal performance and sequencer operations. This may seem odd at first, but given that the ASR can load files while sounds are playing, the load tag also represents the ASR's readiness to load during regular performance operation. Next, we'll briefly skim over these keypad categories. Just keep in mind there'll be a deeper look into each of them during the instrument episode. Starting with number 1, labelled ENV1, is the pitch envelope. This is hardwired to the ASR's pitch and can change the pitch or tune of your samples over time by adding time and level values. But this can also be used as a modulation source to manipulate other destinations or features within the ASR. As a tip, you'll probably want to visit the Edit Mode Pitch category, Pitch Mod page, and apply some value to either envelope 1 or 2 if you intend to use the pitch envelope on any samples. Similarly, envelope 2 is the filter envelope, which is hardwired to the ASR's cutoff frequency filters. The filter envelope has the ability to open and close the filter also over time, and this too can also be used as a modulation source to manipulate other features and parameters within the ASR. But as a tip, you'll need to visit the Edit Filters category, F1 and/or F2 mod pages, and dial in some amount of filter modulation, then choose a controller to manipulate it with. And then envelope 3 is the ASR's amplitude envelope, which is hardwired to the volume of your samples. This can lift or reduce the volume of your samples to the shape of the envelope over time. But unlike envelopes 1 and 2, envelope 3 cannot be used as a modulation source. And these envelopes found in the ASR are not your typical attack, decay, sustain and release envelopes, but are actually a lot more detailed. Instead, these offer a pair of level segments for contouring a customized range of hard and soft velocities, plus 6 time segments. So you can contour your envelopes in much greater detail than common ADSR envelopes. There's also some predefined envelope shape presets you can apply to your samples, which come in handy if you quickly want to browse envelopes that may suit the kind of sound you're working with, whether that be a piano, string, or even a percussive type of sound. As a tip, if you're wanting to configure the behaviour generally associated with the term one-shot, which plays through to the end regardless of where you lift your finger off the key, configure your envelope mode to finish. There's also adjustable hard and soft velocity curves, which you can shape independently of each other. Doing so will provide two unique curves that can either emphasize or detract from the shape of your envelopes by either playing forcefully opposed to playing lightly. A cool trick some of you might find useful is you can copy your custom envelope values and paste them onto another sample. All you have to do is press the enter button at the page labelled envelope equals current value. Doing this will display the message envelope parameters saved. Now when you visit another sample, select the envelope appropriately titled saved, which is where your copy is stored. The next row down, you might be able to see, follows the same order from the top: pitch, filters, and amplitude. The difference being that these are specific commands pertaining to each. You could dive into filter via the edit mode and mess with the filters on the cutoff page by lowering the value of filter 1, which closes the filter as you dial down. You could then, as we did earlier, set up the mod wheel as the F1 modulation source and dial in some range for the scope of the mod wheel, or if you're wanting to contour the filter envelope, to visit these envelope mod pages and adjust them accordingly. The thing to note here is that the ASR has two digital filters, filter 1 and filter 2. Filter 1 is always the low pass filter, whereas filter 2 can be either a low pass or high pass. Across the next row down, we have LFO, wave, and layer. You could set up vibrato on your mod wheel via edit mode, LFO, and browse various LFO shapes and adjust the rate of oscillation and depth, then route the LFO to various destinations inside the ASR. In terms of the wave category, if you approach this via command mode, this is where you'll find the copy and delete functions to delete and copy a sample to another layer or instrument. And under command layer is where you'll find the create new layer command among the copy layer and delete layer functions. And we'll take a look at the layer functions later in the clip. Finally, on the bottom row of the keypad, you'll find the track category. This is where you'll find functions pertaining to the onboard sequencer for various editing functions, mostly relative to sequencing your tracks. And we'll be looking at a few of those later in the clip. I might just add, there's no commands for envelope 1, 2, or 3, nor filter. You can, however, access the pages they do have via the edit mode. So next, if we draw our attention down to the lower left, a couple of things you won't find on the rack model are these two patch select buttons, along with the pitch and modulation wheels. The two patch select buttons offer a convenient way to access up to 4 variations of an instrument that you can configure by using layers, and we'll take a look at layers shortly. These would be handy for a live performer as a means to quickly access variations of a particular instrument. So if you needed different samples to appear in, say, an upcoming verse or chorus, you could pre-configure alternate states of your instruments to reveal additional sounds by pressing a combination of these patch select buttons or even the patch select foot pedals. Check out the rear panel section for more about those. Essentially, the first, second, or combination of both patch select buttons pressed can mute or unmute alternate layers, which you can customize so that they reveal alternate states or sounds. Below those we have your common pitch bender / mod wheel section, which can be configured as controllers to all kinds of modulation destinations inside the ASR and out. So things like opening and closing a filter, panning a sound, adding some vibrato via the modulation wheel, or even modulating certain effects can all be achieved fairly easily, and I'll be demonstrating those throughout this clip. This model, evidently the 6-octave 61-note keyboard version, can respond to velocity sensitivity as well as aftertouch using either channel pressure or polyphonic pressure, also known as polykey pressure, while the ASR-88 on the other hand only has channel aftertouch, which, unlike channel pressure, polykey pressure registers the downward force generated by each individual key, rather than channel pressure's flat rate velocity for all notes pressed across the keybed. Speaking of the keybed, the ASR-10 keybed has fast responsive keys that I find great for lead solos and rhythmic performances with drum kits. Next up, let's take a closer look at these instrument tracks. These 8 buttons here are what the ASR refers to as instrument tracks, and dually act as locations for your instruments, but also correspond to tracks 1 through 8 in the ASR's sequencer. Each instrument track has its own individual mix and pan setting that you can set via edit mode, then the track category. You'll also find the stereo effect buses and stereo output pathways, otherwise referred to as auxiliary outputs, which you'll see abbreviated as AUX throughout the ASR's pages. However, changing this away from the default setting of WaveSample will override the sample's output values found under the edit mode amp category, which also offers those same routing options, which is where you'd go if you were routing individual samples independently of each other. Either way, the options you can choose are the 3 stereo effect buses or the 3 pairs of auxiliary buses, which for those of you with the ASR rack or output expander can route your samples and or instruments out through the physical stereo auxiliary outputs, otherwise referred to as the individual outputs. This WaveSample override is also on offer from the pan setting too, so if needed, you can force an explicit pan value to be adopted by all your samples within the selected instrument. Just make sure you've connected both the main left and right output jacks to hear the ASR output a stereo signal. Speaking of pan, for those wanting to route an instrument through single mono outputs, just pan your instrument, or samples for that matter, hard left or hard right, either via the track page for entire instruments or via the edit amp page for individual samples. Also under the track category is the sequencer status section, where you can mute and solo specific tracks just by selecting an instrument and changing its status from P, the play status, with the up arrow to S for solo, or the down arrow to M for mute, and the asterisks denote unused tracks. The good thing about the Edit Track category is if you've got a few instruments loaded, you can jump from instrument to instrument and change track settings without needing to relocate specific pages. Instruments, as they're referred to, contain your samples and their configuration details, such as how they're laid out across the keyboard, what tuning they may be set to, among many other parameters that we'll get acquainted with over the course of this series. And after clocking up some hours on the ASR, you become familiar with the architecture of the instrument and understanding what you need to do to bring your ideas to life. Then after that, tasks become part of the muscle memory and you don't even have to think about where things are, your hands just know where to go. So the ASR instrument can contain up to 127 samples, otherwise referred to by Ensoniq as WaveSamples. Each of those samples can be allocated to any one of up to 8 instrument layers in various ways for various reasons, such as your common splits, layering sounds on top of each other, or, as mentioned earlier, perhaps utilizing the patch select buttons here to reveal alternate sounds or states of your instruments, each capable of retaining 127 samples multiplied by 8 instruments, and that's over 1,000 samples if memory/time permits. The cool thing about instruments is you can combine them by simply double-clicking instruments when in the solid load mode. You'll notice the yellow selection indicator above the currently selected instrument glows a solid yellow, while any other instruments added to the stack flash yellow to indicate they're now members of the stack too. Then, when you play the keyboard, effectively you'll be playing both or all members of the stack. And you can resume adding or removing instruments from the stack by simply double-clicking to add or single-click to remove existing members from the stack. So no shortage of versatility there. You could quite possibly have all 31 of the ASR's available voices play out simultaneously at the touch of a single key. And then after customizing your instrument layers and or stacks, you can save up to 8 variations of those bank presets by either locating the Create Preset function via Command Mode Instrument, or simply holding down Command and pressing Instrument. This is where you'll be given the opportunity to select a number for your preset, 1 through 8. The UND tag here denotes that the current bank preset is undefined, or empty. So choose an appropriate number with the data entry slider or vertical arrow keys. Once you've customized one or more bank presets, you can save a bank via Command Mode, Instrument category, then scroll to the Save Bank function and hit Enter. Then for easy recall, hold Load, then press Instrument to reveal the bank preset selection page and use the numeric keypad to select a number between 1 and 8. This would come in very handy during a live performance, or maybe even quickly changing to an alternate configuration to access external MIDI devices in your studio. And for the grand finale, you could soak an instrument or bank of instruments in one of the lush effects from the ASR's effect library. So you may be getting a sense of the various ways you can put sounds together inside the ASR, some of which may appear daunting at first, but we'll be breaking them down section by section over the course of this series. So be sure to subscribe and ding the bell for alerts on upcoming episodes. And by the end of the series, I'm confident you'll be making amazing sounds and maybe even songs. There's a clever thing about how the ASR can manage samples, which is worth mentioning. Samples don't necessarily have to be cut into individual pieces, as required by so many other samplers. Instruments possess the ability to link, or for the term of a better word, reference, any portion of a single sample, and many times over too. This can prove to be a very efficient way of managing your samples without having to copy and commit to cropping each sample individually and or destructively, which means potentially a single sample could appear 127 times, but each of those having completely different start and end points to the others. Further to that, instruments can be copied in much the same way, without wasting additional memory, as the copy will reference the same sample data from the original. And there's a shortcut for copying instruments. All you have to do is select an instrument, so it's solid yellow, then hold down a vacant instrument track and press enter. And similarly, I could delete that just as easily by holding down whichever instrument I'd like to delete and pressing the cancel button. Now that we're getting round the boundaries of ASR instrument architecture, it's probably a good time to cover some of the basic principles of how ASR samples relate to and integrate with effects. Ultimately, the ASR offers two sample rate modes for you to work with. The highest being the hi-fi option at 44.1 kHz, which if selected provides the equivalent of CD quality audio, allowing for a maximum of 23 voices to be played simultaneously. With the ASR's memory fully loaded, 16 megs of RAM can reach a maximum sample time of about 3 minutes of mono audio, or half that for stereo. Alternatively, when using the lower sampling rate at 30 kHz, which you could consider the ASR's lo-fi mode, this returns a frequency response of a little under 15,000 Hz, not unlike that of a cassette really. But mind you, it's not exactly 30,000 Hz as it suggests, but more accurately 29.7619 kHz. Regardless of that, the 30K option allows up to a maximum of 31 voices simultaneously and provides a maximum sample time of about 4.5 minutes in mono audio, or half that for stereo. The effects button here is what you press, not only to access dozens of effect types, but also to select the sample rate you'd like the ASR to use. And so, by selecting any particular effect, also determines the ASR's sample rate. If you're using operating system version 2 or above, you'll notice a handful of effects feature 44 kHz in their title. These effect types were purposely developed with a higher sample rate so that you can use the ASR in its hi-fi mode with true CD quality effects. And so if you select a 44K effect, then the ASR will record and play back at 44.1 kHz. If you select an effect without 44 kHz in its title, then the ASR will record and play back in the lower 30 kHz sample rate. ASR effects are powered by Ensoniq's own 24-bit stereo signal processor known as the Ensoniq Signal Processor Chip, or ESP, which is what you'd find if you looked inside the revered DP/2 or DP/4 effects processors, also from Ensoniq. And they're really quite versatile. You can use the effects over your incoming audio signal, like you would with an external effects unit, but you can also sample through the effects processor and record your sample wet with the effects printed into them. Further to that, you could select an instrument effect over a single instrument, which are denoted by the label INST, or a bank effect denoted by the label bank over a bank of instruments. Then with bank effects, you can route instruments or specific samples through any one of the 3 stereo effect buses. There's 50 various effect types, some of which are multi-effects, processing 2 or even 3 different effect types in one. And as mentioned earlier, if you're using Ensoniq operating system version 2 or above, then you'll have access to 62 effect types, 12 of which were developed exclusively with a sample rate of 44.1 kHz. The cool thing about those is if you have the digital interface option installed, you can output true CD quality audio with effects via the digital interface. And by using a digital SPDIF interface, essentially your audio bypasses the onboard digital converters as digital audio on the way in or out of the ASR to or from another digital device that also features a SPDIF interface, commonly found on many audio interfaces and samplers. This might come in useful for those wanting to make digital masters, make edits, or alternate arrangements out of existing songs without leaving the digital domain. If that sounds like you, then you might want to consider the digital interface for your ASR keyboard. That is, if you don't already have it installed. The first group of effects in the list you'll find are ROM-based effects, meaning that they're read-only effects stored inside the ASR. These essentially function as bank effects, but the main difference being you can't save to or replace ROM effects. However, once you edit a ROM effect, it will automatically be copied to the bank effect area, where they then function as regular bank effects. Most effects have certain modulation sources, which can be configured to control certain modulatable destinations, and that provides the ability to manipulate certain aspects of an effect in real time using something like the mod wheel, which I'll give you an example of shortly. There's more than a dozen modulation sources throughout the ASR that are available to control various destinations. Those including the common mod wheel, pitch bender, patch buttons, velocity, channel pressure, sustain pedal, CV pedal, the left foot switch, key down, and a few others, as well as an external MIDI controller labelled XCTRL that you can assign to any MIDI controller number 0 through 127. Factory effect types include a range of reverbs, delays, chorus, flanges, phases, distortion and speaker emulations, like guitar amps and Leslie rotary speaker, plus there's signal processing effects, such as EQ, compressor and ducker, along with sidechaining capability too. Each effect comes with 4 presets, otherwise known as variations, which you can access by pressing Edit Effects, and you can get right into the instrument or bank effect settings and customize the various parameters, then save them to disk to later recall for use with other projects, instruments, or perhaps just to jam with over a guitar or a vocal, etc. There's also additional effect types available for a small fee. Some of you may already be familiar with the WaveBoy effects developed by former Ensoniq engineer Bill Morkley. They're quite interesting too, as they bring a bunch of new features to the ASR that you normally won't find, such as a vocoder, resonant filters, among other weird and wonderful things. You can find them via samplerzone.com, and again, we'll be looking into these during the effects episode. So subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss that one. So let's check out how they work. Starting with the effects select button, pressing this displays the currently selected effect and/or sample rate. To choose an effect, use the vertical arrow keys or data entry slider, to scroll up and down the dozens of effect algorithms. As mentioned earlier, this is also how you choose the sample rate you'd like to work with. If I wanted to sample something using the lo-fi 30 kHz mode, then I'd select the first 30 kHz option here, or choose any effect that doesn't specifically feature 44 kHz in its title, and vice versa. If you wanted to work in the hi-fi 44.1 kHz sample rate, just select an option that bears 44K in the title. If you're still unsure what effect to choose, I'll give you a real-world example. Let's say you're doing a gig, you've got a piano loaded into one of the instrument tracks, and you wanted to use a reverb instrument effect over your piano or whatever sound. You could select an instrument effect, one that displays INST in the title, and save your piano to disk via the command mode instrument category, then save instrument command. Then later when you load that piano back up, that same reverb effect would load back up into that piano's instrument effect slot. And this allows you to have a scenario where you could have each instrument pre-configured with its own unique effect that can be heard when you select the instrument, allowing you to apply an effect to each instrument, which could be really handy for live performers. But before anyone gets the wrong idea, I should point out that the ASR is limited to one active effect selection. You can have several instruments, each with its own instrument effect, but only the selected instrument's effect will be heard. And you can check to see whether or not an instrument has an effect applied to it when an instrument effect is visible via the Effects Select button. Press any instrument, and doing so will reveal the effect currently associated with this selected instrument. If you're using the sequencer with multiple instruments and wish to apply effects across some instruments but not others, then choose a bank or ROM effect and define the instrument's effect buses and or auxiliary buses. You'll find in many cases bus 3 is generally dry. It's also important to mention, if you've configured instrument effects on any of your instruments and then choose a bank or ROM effect, that bank effect replaces instrument effects. ROM effects, in case you missed it earlier, are essentially bank effects. The main difference being you can't overwrite ROM effects, as they're read-only versions that reside on a chip inside the ASR. However, once you edit a ROM effect, it will automatically be copied to the bank effect area and labelled accordingly. But once there, you can further edit it and or save it via Command Effects, then browse to save bank effect. In one respect, you could consider ROM effects as a blank canvas or safety template that you can't mess up. So next, I'll show you a trick you can try yourself. Let's pull up ROM effect number 16, Hall Reverb 2. Then edit effects and look for the page with modulator source 1. I'll set this up so I can increase the reverb tail using the mod wheel. But first, let's review the minimum and maximum controller ranges for modulation source 1. You can fine-tune them as little as you need by changing the minimum to as much as you need by setting the maximum. Next, set modulator 1's destination source, labelled DST1, to be the reverb decay time. I might just quickly disable the mod wheel LFO/vibrato. Now, if you play some notes on the keyboard and move the mod wheel all the way up, you should have a long reverb tail, reminiscent of Vangelis's Blade Runner. And for a cool trick, you can view the destination or modulation source and press Enter to toggle between the source and the destination. Just be sure that the Edit Track Effect Mode Control option is set on for this trick to work. Bank effects can have two different modulation sources, destination parameters, and defined modulation ranges. But the thing is, not all effect variations have these modulation sources. So you can browse through the pages of each effect to see what the effect you may be using has to offer. From this point, this edited effect, now with modulation control, could be saved by hitting Command Effects, or if it was an instrument effect, you could just as easily save it, along with the instrument, using the Command Instrument function, Save Instrument. Just be mindful of the effect you want over your mix, because it too determines the sample rate of your sound or song. If, for whatever reason, you find you'd like an instrument effect to use as a bank effect, you can use the Copy Effect function under Command Effects to convert your effect types from instrument to bank or vice versa. And that's just really the icing on the cake in terms of the ASR's effects, which we'll get deeper into during the effects episode. So subscribe and click the bell to be notified of upcoming episodes. So now I'll disable the effects by choosing one of these effects equals off options, but select the option with the sample rate I intend to record with. As you can see, those being the 44K option, being able to produce 23 voices, or the lo-fi option at 30 kHz, being able to play 31 voices at the same time. So next, let's bring some audio into the ASR. By routing audio into the ASR, not only can you achieve the obvious task of sampling, but you can use your ASR as an effects processor, or record a vocal track direct to hard disk, or maybe just sample a short drum sound. Whichever task you have, you'll probably want to engage the ASR's audio monitors for monitoring or recording audio. And you do that here by enabling these left and right monitor inputs. But before you do, check that your rear mic line switch is in the downward position. Some may need the mic line switch in the up position for recording directly from a microphone, or perhaps purposely distorting the incoming audio content. I'm presuming the majority of users will sample from line-level devices, such as audio interfaces, DJ mixers, CD players, etc. The rear input level dial isn't in the easiest of places to reach, particularly if you're using the rack model stacked between other gear in an enclosed rack cabinet. So if that's the case, then I suggest leaving the input level somewhere between the 12 and 3 o'clock position. I wouldn't advise leaving this all the way up, as your noise floor will increase noticeably along with it. Instead, control the input signal going into the ASR from the source if you can. Next, make sure you've got some audio cables connected to one of, or both, rear inputs. From this point, you can select either one or both A and B input sources. A represents the left rear input, and B represents the right rear input. Enabling these so that they glow red arms the ASR to record from the red lit sources. If both glow red, then the ASR is poised to record in stereo. You can toggle these on and off by pressing repeatedly. Yellow LEDs are indicative of a general selection, whether it be an instrument or otherwise. Press the Sample/Source Select button, and from here you can also change the ASR's input source, where you'll find an option titled Main Out. This allows you to conveniently sample whatever audio is coming out of the ASR's main output, which also gives the ASR the ability to function as a 2-track audio editor. You could potentially sample each section of your song and arrange it as stereo audio, then add more instrument tracks over the top or perhaps just edit extended mixes or alternate arrangements in a similar fashion to how they used to make extended 12-inch mixes back in the days of splicing tape for tape machines. In the event you select the main out as your input source, the ASR will automatically disable the input monitors, as the source monitor doesn't need to monitor its own output, which is probably a good thing, as that's a recipe for feedback. And in addition to that, the ASR will also mute the sequencer click. That is, if your click setting under Edit Sequence Song is set to record. If you don't want the click muted, you can force the click to remain on at all times by changing its setting to on. From this point, you're ready to cue some audio or start the sequencer by pressing play. If you don't already have an instrument selected, press enter, and the ASR will display a prompt to pick a sample instrument. So select any particular instrument track, and from the VU page, hitting enter at any time will start recording audio. Then hit the no button to stop sampling. Then you'll be presented with the play root key or enter page. This is where you delegate the nominal pitch or root key of your sample with a specific note on the keyboard. Generally, C4 is the standard, which is what the enter key will trigger for you by default, unless configured otherwise. The enter key may not be completely necessary for the keyboard models, but comes in very handy on the rack model. If you find your sample's not very loud, it's likely the 96 dB of ASR headroom is giving off the impression that it's distant. If you had 20 samples playing at the same time, you'd probably need to turn them down. But what you can do is give it a boost by visiting Edit Mode, Amp Category, and scroll to the function in there called Boost. Change this to On, which then gives your sample a 12 dB boost. You'll probably end up reaching for this quite a bit, so use the shortcut Edit Amp and number 6 via the keypad to take you straight there after recording some audio. In the event you record some audio using the main out option, the ASR will automatically enable this boost option on that particular sample for you. The next task after sampling some audio is generally trimming off any unnecessary length or dead air by truncating. To do that, we can edit the sample by enabling the ASR's edit mode. Then via the wave category, you'll find pages relating to loop points, plus start and end points. From here, you can use the left-right arrow keys to move the cursor horizontally. Then when the cursor is under a field, you can use the up-down arrow keys and the data entry fader. You can also repeatedly hit whichever category you're in to progress to the next page, and if you hold the right button down and push on the up arrow, you can page right, or alternatively, holding down the left arrow, you can page left. Depending on the feature, numerical fields like this one here represent the whole number as a percentage value. This is an additional, at times faster alternative to scrolling through tens of thousands of samples. So for example, if you wanted to trim 25% off the start of your sample, you could place your cursor under the percentage field and dial it up to 25. Or you could dial up to 50% to jump to the halfway point of your sample. But if you wanted 50%, you could use an even easier shortcut of pressing both up and down arrows at the same time, which returns an amount of exactly half the whole value. If you make a mistake, or don't like how the newly changed value sounds, hit the Cancel No button to return the value to what it was previously, kinda like an undo. If you're happy with your new start point, you can cursor across to the sample end page and do the same there too. Once you're happy with the changes, you can visit the truncate command to purge the excess sample data and free up some of that precious memory. To do that, hit the command mode, then wave category, and scroll horizontally until you find truncate WaveSample, and hit the Enter/Yes button to run the function. Okay, great. So next, you may want to create a loop. So in much the same way, you can edit your loop start and end points, but before you do that, loops require a playback mode to be set to instruct them which direction you want them to loop. So you'll need to look up the playback mode page, which is also found via the Edit Wave pages. And this instructs the ASR which one of 3 loop types you want to use. By default, new samples will be set to play forward with no loop. Alternatively, you can select backwards with no loop, or loop forward, plays forward and loops around. And loop bidirection plays forward, then backwards and repeats. And there's another option we'll look into in the instrument episode. There's also the loop position page, which allows you to shift or nudge your loop while its length remains intact. You might be able to hear that little click in there. So now's probably a good time to mention that the ASR has a handy auto loop finder function hiding under the edit mode system pages. With this enabled, changes to your loop start values are nudged to the nearest 0 crossing to assist with finding a flat point for your sample to cycle at. You may still need to adjust your loop end or loop position for your own personal satisfaction, but the auto find feature will assist with the front end of your loop. And for those interested, there's a nifty little loop length calculator I've created for the ASR, along with many other samplers, free to use via the ToneLab website. And what it does is calculates a loop value so that your samples can cycle perfectly in time with whatever tempo you're using. You can basically loop anything in durations of bars, half bars, or measures of common quantize values. There's a quick tip demonstrating how it works over on the Quick Tips channel if you'd like to see it in action. I'll leave the link in the description below. So before we record another sample into the ASR, now's probably a good time to get familiar with this sample context page, which is what you use to locate and select samples inside your instruments. Here we can see that the currently selected instrument is titled Unnamed. Layer 1 is displayed and it has a wave sample number of 1. So what's this all mean? Well, let's break it down in basic terms. The structure of an ASR instrument possesses the ability to hold up to 127 wave samples, also known as samples. These WS numbers, aka wave sample numbers, are automatically allocated to each sample as you add them to your instrument, starting from 1 through 127. And whichever number is displayed in the WS field is what your ASR considers to be the currently selected wave sample. And I might just quickly load my TL808 kit to provide a more thorough example. Now, if you have more than one sample in your selected instrument, as this 808 kit does, you can select the other samples a few different ways, using the arrow keys or moving the data entry slider while your cursor is under the WaveSample field. Alternatively, pressing keys across the keyboard will display wave samples that are allocated to those keys. That is, if there's any allocated to those keys you're pressing. If there's samples on other layers, then your wave sample field will display all. And that's because its ability to reach those samples may be impaired due to a layer selection. So if I change my layer selection, then I'll be able to reach those samples residing on other layers. Each available voice, in polyphony terms, has a digital oscillator, an LFO, a random noise generator, 2 digital multi-mode filters, and 3 envelope generators. Those being your usual suspects: pitch, filter, and amplitude, plus a very adequate modulation matrix that can use more than a dozen modulation sources throughout the ASR. In addition to that, any one of those samples could then be distributed across any one of those 8 layers, which can be used in various ways. For example, setting up patch select mute groups, or possibly even creating your own keyboard splits, one layer featuring a monophonic sound while having a piano on another. Furthermore, you can specify any desired range of keys to access whichever sample from a single note to the entire length of the key bed. To do that, check that your sample is currently selected, go into edit mode, press the pitch category, scroll using the arrows until you find the WS range page. Here you can press any key on your keyboard and the ASR uses that note as the lowest key, followed by whichever second note as the highest key. Between them is what's defined as the wave sample's range for your currently selected sample. And this is how you go about spreading samples across your keyboard to make keyboard splits or drum kits. But in the case of drum kits, rather than use a broad range of notes, just select a key range of maybe 1 or 2 notes per sample. As a tip, once you set your high key, move the cursor away from the page before hitting the keyboard again. Otherwise, you'll keep changing the high with each note pressed. Now that's done, when you return to the sample context page, you should find that you're able to select different WaveSample IDs by pressing notes inside the newly defined key range, opposed to pressing notes outside of the defined range. And once again, you can cursor into the layer field and change the WaveSample ID to all, which effectively selects all samples pertaining to a particular instrument layer for editing. Or you can select all layers by shifting your cursor left under the instrument name, and in doing so, an A will appear in the layer field to indicate that all layers are selected. Just be mindful that not all commands and edit functions can process an all selection, which is probably a good thing. A lot of them do require a specific wave sample to be selected, but the good thing is you'll be prompted to do so by those features that require a specific selection. Moving on from here, one thing that might bother some of you are these nondescript instrument names over here. For those all about good housekeeping, you can name the currently selected instrument via the edit mode, then through the instrument category. Scroll till you find the name page and enter in a name for your instrument using the cursor keys and data entry slider. You'll see the first 8 characters in the sample context page here rather than the generic unnamed title. So next, let's take a look into the layers category to see what you can do in here. First of all, let's create a new layer via command layer. And upon returning to the sample context page, we can now see the layer I just created, layer 3, is available to select and populate with samples. So if we digress for a moment and visit Edit Instrument and scroll to the patch page, the patch page displays the 8 layers of your selected instrument. You'll notice my first 2 layers are numbered and visible. By selecting either Patch Select button, I can mute and unmute specific layers in my instrument. What's interesting about my case with the stereo sample is stereo samples use linked pairs of layers. For that reason, I can mute the left or the right layer by holding down either Patch Select button 1 or 2 respectively. Or if I hold down both, I can mute both layers. And you customize these by holding either one or both Patch Select buttons and cursoring under any one of the 8 layer numbers, then using the vertical arrows to show or hide the layer numbers you wish to reveal for each button that you're holding. In some instances, you may have multiple samples overlapping each other, and that makes it confusing for the ASR to understand exactly which sample you're trying to select. So in that scenario, you can place the cursor under the layer or WaveSample field and use your arrow keys to scroll through the samples or layers to locate a specific sample or layer you'd like to edit. Further to that, you could place the cursor under the layer or instrument field and visit various edit pages to sneak a peek at values correlating to other samples sharing a similar function. And if you're doing that because you want to copy a specific value from a particular page, such as a loop point or a sample start, endpoint, etc., then the ASR has your back there too, as you can copy a unique value from various fields by placing your cursor under it and hitting the enter button. This copies the value into memory, so you can paste it into another compatible field by again placing your cursor under it and then pressing the cancel button to paste it in. By default, any new layer will be empty, so what you can do is copy sounds from another layer or potentially another instrument, or maybe even sample a sound directly into a specified layer. This is how I go about setting up mute groups in the ASR drum kits for the ToneLab store. You can go into Layer Glide mode and configure the selected layer to be monophonic by using Trigger or one of the other legato modes. For this demonstration, I'll create a new WaveSample and place it in the recently created Layer 3 via Command, Wave, Create New WaveSample. Now, I should be able to hear that new WaveSample. But I'm guessing my patch select layers aren't configured to reveal layer 3. So let's go into Edit Instrument and add layer 3 to the patch select configuration. There it is. Now let's go into Edit Layer, Glide Mode page, and configure the selected layer to be monophonic by using Trigger or any other one of the legato modes. Now that I've set up a lead solo on layer 3, I could return to the patch select page via Edit Instrument, and using the patch select buttons, I could mute and unmute just those sounds on layer 1 by holding one or both patch select buttons here. Just keep in mind, when using stereo samples, you'll notice stereo samples use two layers, a layer for the left channel and a layer for the right channel. Layers 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and 7 and 8 can or will be utilized to manage stereo pairs. The left channel always assumes the even number of a pair, while the right channel assumes the odd number of a pair. Now, before I give the wrong impression, that's not necessarily relative to how samples are panned or routed to the physical outputs. It's just how the ASR's instrument architecture manages stereo samples. Essentially, they're two mono samples linked across a pair of layers. And because of that, you could potentially create your own stereo samples, phase shifting one channel a little out of step with the opposite channel to create your own chorusing effects over your samples without using any effects at all. And we'll get more into that sort of thing during the instrument episode. So now that we've had a decent look through how the sample context page functions, now's probably a good time to show off a few essential commands and edit tools. Those being how to delete, copy, and create new samples. Starting with delete. Select any particular sample you'd like to purge from memory via the WaveSample field here. Now, if we'd like to command the ASR to delete this, go through Command mode, then the Wave category, and scroll to find the Delete WaveSample command. Execute that by hitting yes, then confirming that by again pressing yes or no. Then, upon returning to the sample context page, you'll now find that the WaveSample allocated to the number you previously selected has gone, and its WaveSample number will now be available for another sample to take its place. Now, let's try copying a sample. Again, find a WaveSample to select for copying. I'll use the long 808 symbol from my 808 kit and paste it into layer 3 on this new instrument I created earlier. And this particular task doesn't fall under Edit, as it's a processing command found under, you guessed it, Command mode. Then scroll to Copy WaveSample, then hit Enter to run the command. Select an instrument and enter that in. Then select a layer for the destination. I'll choose the newly created layer 3 and enter. Okay, great. Now that 808 symbol exists within this instrument here. So now I could duplicate that again if I wanted to create a slightly different version of it within this instrument. So let's do that. Again, check the sample context page, make sure our sample is selected, then via Command Wave, scroll to find Copy WaveSample, select the instrument and layer to copy it into. Only this time we're faced with a conundrum. Do we copy params only, or do we copy params and data? The params and data option will copy all settings pertaining to the selected sample, so things like tuning, key range, sample start/endpoints, among many other parameters, plus the physical sample data itself. Effectively, this creates a new physical sample in the ASR memory, reducing the memory capacity by the size of the sample copied. Alternatively, if you choose parameters only, the ASR does a clever little memory saving trick where it only copies the settings of your selected sample and links back to the original rather than duplicating the physical sample data, which is a very efficient way of managing precious memory. To give you a real-world scenario, if you sampled a 1-bar drum break, you could either leave the drum break as one whole sample, but copy the parameters only 3 times, then edit the start and end points of samples 2, 3, and 4 so that they start 1 beat further in than the previous sample. Effectively, you end up with 3 virtual slices that are referencing the original whole sample, that is WaveSample 1. Alternatively, if you decide to run with parameters and data, then essentially you're duplicating the whole sample, which in turn uses up that much sample data/memory again. Or in the case of this example, sample memory is used 4 times. But then again, you could still trim each of those down to 4 quarters, run them all through the truncate command, and then they'd be 4 quarter slices, made from the original 1 bar long sample. You can choose either, but there are considerations to be made. In a scenario where you may only want 3 out of 4 parameter slices processed in a certain way, you'll have to destructively process the parent sample that provides data to the virtual wave samples. And I call them virtual wave samples because despite them not having data as physical samples do, virtual samples also assume a wave sample position in the sample context page. But worry about those kinds of considerations when you come to them, as you can always create data copies out of a parent sample if you run into issues using virtual samples. So next, let's take a look at the new wave sample option. There's a couple of ways to create a new wave sample. The most obvious would be sampling some audio, but there's also a curious option you might stumble across via command mode through the wave category called Create New Wave Sample. Running this command generates a tiny square wave that by default is looped. This may be useful to use as a test tone, or possibly to make your own synth sounds out of. But perhaps more commonly, if you're building a new instrument from scratch, then you'll notice the word new appears in the wave sample field and possibly an N in the layer field. The presence of the N, or new, is notifying you that the selected instrument is ready to catch the next sample recorded. If there's no layer available, then it's likely you'll see an N for new layer, along with the word new in the wave sample field, indicating that a new layer and a new wave sample will be created in the process automatically. Hitting the sample source button here will place you into the record source page where you choose the input you'd like the ASR to record from. Input dry left means the ASR will be recording from the left channel with no effects. Input dry right means the ASR will be recording from the right channel with no effects. Input plus effects will monitor and record the output of the effects processor, printing the effects into your incoming audio. Main out will record anything directed to the main outputs and effect buses 1, 2, and 3. But the thing to remember about this is it's an analog post-master fader signal path, so make sure your master volume is all the way up for the best signal to noise ratio. If you have the digital interface installed, you'll be able to sample from 44.1 and 48 kHz digital sources. There's also input dry left and right, which records in stereo without effects. As a tip, it's generally a good idea to consider the sample rate of your project before you start sampling. Whether you're working in hi-fi or lo-fi, check your desired sample rate / effect setting. If you've got an instrument in mind you'd like to add a new sample to, select it or hit enter from the record source page, and the ASR will add your newly recorded sample into whichever instrument track you select. If you've selected an instrument that already exists, you'll be presented with the sample context page where you can select an existing layer or even a new layer by cursoring under the layer field and using the vertical arrows to select N for new layer. Hit enter if that's your desired layer, and hit enter again to confirm that's where your sample is to go. Whichever path you decide to take, you'll then be presented with the graphic VU metering page, otherwise known as the level detect mode. The layout here will probably look familiar to those with previous sampler experience, as it's your typical graphic VU meter which appears in many classic samplers. The asterisk represents the automatic trip threshold that you can adjust by pressing up or down on the arrow keys. So I'll cue some audio, and the word amp will appear in the display when you clip the input ceiling. So back your input level off a little if that flashes, and watch your green and red LEDs over here too. If the red LED gives you the impression your signal is distorting, don't worry too much, as the red LED will light when your signal breaches -6 dB. What you really ought to keep your eye on is this amp prompt, but that is if you're after a nice clean sound. If you don't mind a crunchy sound, then you could intentionally overload the input ceiling, which is entirely at your discretion, of course. I find the ASR has a pleasant footprint, not harsh nor brittle. So try out various input levels, hot, cold, -6 dB or 12 dB over. Sometimes the crunch you get from unleashing hell into these converters may be more pleasing than a distortion pedal. So experiment with the good, the bad, and the ugly, and run with whatever sounds good to you. While on the subject of converters, for those that are interested, there's a sample comparison series here on the channel where I put classic samplers up against each other and feed various audio sources through them to see how they stack up next to each other. I'll leave the link in the description below. Next, we should set the threshold. When you press the enter button, the ASR will wait patiently for an incoming signal to trip the threshold before automatically recording. There's also a pre-trigger buffer via the sample pages that you can cursor left or right to. This clever little feature retains the audio just before the point of where your threshold is triggered. You can dial in a value in milliseconds here. Alternatively, you can force the sampling of audio by moving your threshold all the way to the left and pressing enter to force the ASR into record. Once recording is underway, you'll see the countdown in seconds, indicating how much memory is left to record. From here, hit the yes or no button at any time to stop recording. Then the ASR will prompt you to play root key or enter. From this point, you could hit the enter key, which by default will trigger C4 on your keyboard, and you can change this trigger note to anything you prefer via the edit mode system category enter plays key page, which is what I used to do when I was using the rack model. If your ASR rack is tethered to a MIDI keyboard, you can press a note on your MIDI keyboard all the same. Or if you know you won't be needing any alternate tuning, you can always disable the tuning option for this particular layer via Edit Layer and change the pitch table option to No Pitch. This removes any chromatic tuning from the samples residing in the currently selected layer. If you're creating a basic drum kit, that may save some time adjusting pitch or tunings for half a dozen or so samples. Otherwise, if you're sampling a piano, bass, string or some other sound you intend to play melodies with, you should probably just run with a C note, especially if you sampled your sound from a tuned instrument. If you're unsure what key a sample's in, then run a tuner app or plugin over it and match it with the same note on your keyboard. As a tip, if you're not sure what pitch your sample should be, then just run with the default C4, because you can easily alter the pitch and fine tuning of any sample selected via the sample context page. Plus, chances are you may retrospectively edit the pitch and fine tuning belonging to other samples from time to time too. So via Edit Mode, press Pitch Category, look up the root key page where you can change the root key and fine tuning of any selected sample. The root key feature offers quite a broad range too. You can shift the root note of your sample up to about 10 octaves in either direction. Excessive depths or highs might return some strange results, but they're great places to start if you're wanting to design some industrial textures. Values starting with K is the range below C0, but you'll probably need to transpose your instrument up to hear anything lurking below C0. And without confusing this with the sample transpose, you can transpose an instrument along with all samples contained within it further up and down the key bed via the Edit Instrument category and scroll to the Transpose Octave Semitone page, where you can transpose an entire instrument by octaves or semitones. So that's more or less the concept of how the sample context page helps fit and position your samples into layers within each instrument, and how samples are recorded and or added to your instruments. As you work through populating your instruments with samples, you may need to check from time to time on how you're doing with memory. There's a handy option available from the sample page. This will give you a read in seconds based on the current sample rate or effect selected. Next, let's make a basic sequence with a couple of instruments. While the ASR can do it all, the onboard sequencer may not be the most comprehensive you can find, but don't let that deter you, as it is quite capable nonetheless. Fundamentally, it's a 96 pulse per quarter note, 8-track sequencer, capable of retaining 80 sequences, with each sequence capable of being up to 999 bars long. There's a minimum tempo of 20 BPM, ranging up to a maximum of 250, and those values are without decimal place. So you'll be working in whole BPM values. If that's going to be a problem for you, you could potentially work around that by using an external MIDI clock or external sequencer, which isn't that uncommon. I'm sure some of you have seen an MPC 3000 or MPC 2000 XL paired up with an ASR. If you're interested in that idea, there's also a complete tutorial here on the channel for that too. The ASR's also capable of holding one song at a time, which is basically a group of sequences chained together. And arranging a song is much like creating your common playlist, where a song can retain up to 99 sequence positions, known as steps, where you can allocate any particular sequence to any particular step. And those steps can then be configured to repeat up to 63 times each. Further to that, song steps have the ability to store each instrument track's mute status as well as a transpose value. And potentially that could save you a bit of time and memory, because a single sequence could provide multiple variations by simply muting some tracks and or transposing any particular instrument track. And that essentially allows you to create alternate variations of the same sequence, but one that has key changes, breakdowns, etc., without the need to record or edit additional sequences. Once you've arranged and configured your steps, you could then record an additional 8 tracks of MIDI into a song layer using the same set of instrument tracks here. And for the cherry on the cake, you could then record a stereo pair of audio tracks or 2 mono tracks over the top of your song, bounce them down to one track and record another, bounce that down and record another again. You could, however, record RAM tracks or disk tracks over a sequence, but the ASR only has provisions for 2 tracks of either sequence audio or song audio, which may come in handy in a situation where you'd like to record some vocal ad-libs, maybe some rhythm guitar, or possibly even scratching a record over a beat. Now, considering that at the time of this recording, the ASR is 30 plus years old, that's still quite impressive. Even the current range of MPCs have been struggling to implement direct-to-disc recording for a while now. Once your song starts to take shape, or if you're terrified of messing something up, you can save your song or elements of it to disk or hard drive. And the concept behind storing your song projects goes a little something like: you save each instrument, your sequences and or effects, plus system settings, etc. Then last of all, you save a bank. And what the bank file does is, rather than contain the physical files itself, it serves as a manifest for storing things like which tracks your instruments were on, plus the names of the discs that were used to save them, if any. So later, when you need to load your project, rather than have to load all the relative pieces one by one, the bank file is responsible for retrieving each of those components. Or in other words, it keeps tabs on where you've saved your sequences, system settings, effects, and instruments, and also which tracks they were allocated to. So even if the files you saved are scattered across multiple disks, a bank file will go as far as to request the name of the disk where the instrument came from, in its attempt to rebuild your ASR project with all the different components you saved. For that reason, it's wise to name and label your floppy disks or disk images with some consideration. And there'll be more on this shortly in the storage section of this clip. But in terms of the ASR's sequencer functions are labelled across the panel in orange. And your instrument tracks, numbered 1 through 8 here, also represent sequencer tracks. So your selected instrument will automatically record into a sequence track that corresponds with whichever instrument is selected. You can set the sequence tempo via edit mode, then the sequence song category, and scroll until you come to the tempo loop page. The tempo is sequence specific, so changing this applies only to the current sequence, along with its loop status, which by default is on, meaning that your current sequence will repeat indefinitely until you hit stop. As a tip, you can tap in the tempo in real time by tapping the enter button twice. If you're happy with your tempo, then you'll be ready to record some chords or beats, etc. But before we do, let's run through the basic transport controls: record, stop or continue, and play. These function in essence like vintage tape recorders, where you hold down record and press play at the same time. The ASR, by default, will give you a 4 count. Then the first time in, we'll wait patiently for a MIDI event to kick off the sequencer in record. You can also hold down record and continue if you prefer to resume recording from the location where you previously stopped. Hitting stop at any time will stop the sequence from recording and define the length of a new sequence. You'll then be presented with the audition page, which is where you can commit to or undo the recording using the yes button to keep or no button to reject. And then this audition page will be presented to you throughout many areas of the ASR, for example, when recording into the sequencer or running just about any other form of destructive process, such as truncating, aka trimming your samples, normalizing, reversing, etc. You can position the cursor under either side and audition the changes by playing, then finally keeping the new version by hitting enter, or undoing the last change by hitting cancel. There's also punch-in style recording, where you can play your sequence, then hit record at any time to drop in and record anywhere you like. You can position the cursor under either side and audition your changes by comparing. Then finally deciding on the new version by hitting enter or reverting to the previous version by hitting cancel. And in relation to that, you have one of a few different modes of recording available to you via edit mode, sequence song category, then look for sequence record mode. You can set record to replace, add, or looped modes. Replace is on by default and will overwrite any data currently recorded into your sequence's instrument track before it reaches the end of your sequence. Add is the equivalent of what many of you might know as overdub, whereas new notes and events are recorded but added to any existing notes or events in your selected track. Looped is similar to the workflow found on classic drum machines, where the sequencer cycles continuously, allowing additional notes or events to be added indefinitely. However, unlike replace and add, looped recording will remain in a looped state of record until you manually stop the sequencer. By default, the ASR starts up in replace mode, so you might want to keep the page ID shortcut for this page handy, which is edit mode sequence song 9. So now I'll delete this sequence and let's try recording some notes by selecting an instrument and holding down the record and pressing play. You should hear the metronome give you a 4 count. I'll jump in on the 1. Then I'll stop the sequencer and be presented with the audition page where you can listen back to your recording. Then keep or cancel the recording by hitting either yes for keep or no to reject. Okay, cool. So that's a basic recording with the samples from the instrument I created. So now I'll speed walk you through a bunch of basic sequencer essentials that you're likely to need more often than not. We're currently in the Edit Mode Sequencer Song category, which is indicated in the display, and in this category you'll find Sequencer Count Off, which is your metronome count-in. You can turn it off, permanently on, only during record, or quiet. Quiet being a 1-bar count-in without an audible click. Here we have click volume. If your metronome is too loud, then you can turn it down here, 0 being silent, while 99 being the loudest. Here we have the click note value. You can adjust the time signature of your metronome, along with in which states will it be audible, whether that be only during record, on constantly, or off entirely. If you need to create a blank empty sequence, then via command mode, visit the sequence song category and scroll to create new sequence, where you can dial in a name for the new sequence using the arrow keys and/or data entry slider. And then nominate the time signature. If you need to make a copy of the currently selected sequence, via command mode, visit the sequence category and scroll to copy sequence. Hit enter, select a sequence, hit enter, customize a name for the copy, then return to the sequencer to check it out. To delete a sequence or song, again via command mode and sequence category, scroll to delete sequence, use the arrow keys or slider to select and enter to confirm deletion. If you'd like to quantize the selected instrument track, then via command mode, visit the track category and look up quantize. Select a track to quantize and press enter. Here you can select various quantize values to apply to the selected instrument track, along with the entire range of keys, beats or bars, or a select range that you can nominate using your keyboard and arrow keys. If you need to erase the selected instrument track from the current sequence, via command mode, visit the track category and scroll to find Erase Undefined Track, select your track and enter to confirm. Here we have Append Sequence. If you'd like to join two sequences together or double the length of an existing sequence, use this function. Use the sequencer information command to interrogate details about a particular sequence, such as sequence length, time signature, the total memory sequencer capacity, the selected sequence memory capacity, and the duration in minutes and seconds. Use Change Sequence Length if you'd like to shorten or extend the length of your sequence by amounts of bars with the arrow keys. Edit song steps, as seen earlier. Use this function to arrange your sequences into a song script. Save song and all sequences. You can save an individual sequence. However, this is the more encapsulating method to include all the sequences and a song. Use your data entry slider and arrow keys to give it a meaningful name, and then the enter button to execute the save. To quickly copy an instrument, select any particular instrument, then while holding down an empty instrument track, press Enter. To quickly delete an instrument, select and hold any particular instrument, then hit the Cancel button. Event Edit Track is what some of you might refer to as Step Edit, where you can move between steps in your sequence and operate on a specific step one at a time. With this feature, you can modify the velocity or length of your notes along with their position. You can also add and delete them too. You can use the Enter, Cancel buttons to respectively insert or delete any particular events in the list. Simply use the data entry fader or up and down arrows to browse the steps in the list. While there's still plenty to cover, I'll just speed walk you through a few instrument track related functions. You could use an empty instrument track and create a blank instrument that doesn't contain any samples. And what you might do with this is, apart from build another instrument full of samples, is use it to represent an external MIDI device in your studio to create parts in your sequence that trigger an external synth or some other type of sound module. Visit the Command Mode, Instrument category, and scroll to find Create New Instrument. Hit Enter, select an unused instrument where you'd like it allocated. And now you have a virtual instrument you can use to communicate with external MIDI gear. But the first thing you'll probably need to do is configure the instrument's MIDI settings so it can communicate with an external MIDI device over a specified MIDI channel. To do that, while it's selected, visit the Edit Mode, System MIDI category, then scroll to Transmit On and configure this option to Instrument Channel. What this does is configures the ASR's MIDI matrix in such a way so that each instrument transmit MIDI out from its own unique MIDI channel, opposed to the bass channel option, which funnels all MIDI traffic to transmit over a single specific channel. And your bass channel, also located under this category, can be changed to any MIDI channel number 1 through 16. So if you need a specific instrument to transmit MIDI out over a different or specific channel, then you can edit the MIDI out channels of instruments via the Edit Mode Instrument category, scroll to MIDI out channel, and select whichever instrument you'd like to change. Just make sure your Transmit On feature is set to Instrument Channel, as described a moment ago. Otherwise, all instruments will transmit via the MIDI bass channel. As a tip, if for whatever reason you get hung notes, you can use the MIDI Panic /All Notes Off function by hitting the Effects Select Bypass button, followed by Cancel. And this will send a Note Off message out across each MIDI channel, which should release any stuck notes inside the ASR and on those devices tethered to the ASR. For those wanting to sync their ASR with an external device, you can configure the ASR's MIDI clock so that it follows an external clock fed in through the rear MIDI input. By visiting Edit Mode, Sequence Song, scroll to Clock Source and change the default setting of internal to MIDI. The thing to note about the MIDI setting is that the ASR will wait patiently for an external clock to arrive via the MIDI import before it can proceed to play or record. If your ASR appears to have stalled, you may need to hit play on your external MIDI device to initiate the play or record function. So check your external MIDI device and make sure it's configured to send out a MIDI clock. Now that you might have instruments playing a sequence, by this point the responsible thing to do would be to save your precious work. So let's get familiar with the ASR's storage options, along with how to save and load song elements. So now let's get familiar with the ins and outs of the ASR's ability to store files. Then we'll run through some of the essential saving and loading tasks. First, there's some important limitations I think new owners should be made aware of, as with the wrong options or wrong handling, you could impact the ASR's ability to function efficiently, or worse, boot up at all. As mentioned earlier, the ASR was shipped with quad-density 3.5-inch floppy disk drives, capable of storing up to 1.6 megabyte. Many owners probably have, or will have to, replace their floppy drives at some point. So it's good to be aware of the pros and cons of floppy emulators, such as Gotex and Lotharic drives. While they present a more robust option than physical floppy disks, they also adhere to the same capacity constraints as, say, a higher density floppy disk, which for the ASR is 1.6 megabyte. And that would generally pose a problem for a lot of samplers using a floppy disk drive, but not the ASR, as it can save a single sample of, say, 20 seconds or more across multiple disks or disk images, which are essentially one of the same thing when viewed by the ASR. But if you're planning on recording lengthy samples or having comprehensive instruments, then I'd suggest considering a faster, more efficient storage option, such as a Zulu SCSI or some other type of SCSI device. Having said that, there aren't many options to replace a floppy disk drive with, so it's perfectly understandable why people reach for the floppy disk emulators in that respect. But it's worth mentioning you don't necessarily need a floppy or Gotek drive, despite some claims that you can't boot your ASR without it. While it may appear that way, you can boot the operating system from an ASR formatted SCSI drive. A couple of limitations to be aware of though. The maximum format capacity can accommodate 8 gigabytes, which I believe is also shared with the EPS. However, after a discussion with Sample Zone, they claim SCSI drives will perform more efficiently reading and writing from 2 gigabyte formatted drives, which these days isn't so bad if you're using a multi-location device, such as a Zulu SCSI, that tricks the ASR into thinking you've got multiple SCSI devices connected. Visit samplerzone.com if you're interested in getting yourself one of those. Despite whichever SCSI device or floppy emulator you end up with, there's also a 38 file limit per directory. You'll get a sense of this when you see the file numbers allocated alongside your files. File numbers 1 through 38 will be applied to each file saved in each directory. However, it's unlikely you'll hit that limit on floppy disks or floppy disk images all that often compared with, say, most SCSI devices that possess much larger storage capacities. And if you plan on using a SCSI device, then I recommend formatting it with the operating system, which we'll get into in a moment. But it's also wise to consider a plan of how to structure your directories. You can create folders, aka directories, via the command mode System MIDI category and scroll until you come to Create Directory. Hit Enter and you'll be prompted to provide a name for the directory. While browsing this category, you'll also find the command to change storage device. Here you define the SCSI channel ID that your SCSI device is set to. Just make sure you avoid SCSI ID 3, as 3 is the channel used by the ASR. And as a word of caution, be careful not to connect or disconnect your SCSI devices while the power is on. The ASR does not support hot swapping, and be careful not to connect SCSI devices with just any cable. The wrong pin configuration will likely cause some damage. Unfortunately, the ASR's SCSI fuse can blow, and quite easily if you don't know what you're doing. Plus, it's quite a pain to replace. So remember to always power down your ASR and your SCSI devices before disconnecting or configuring them. Call me superstitious, but I wouldn't change the storage device's physical SCSI channel while connected and powered up either. Particularly if you have multiple SCSI devices attached to your SCSI chain, which if you do, make sure that only the last device in the chain, and not those in between, has its terminated option enabled. SCSI channel conflicts can happen when two devices try to reside on the same SCSI channel ID, and those conflicts can cause devices to freeze and lock up, or in extreme circumstances, corrupt data, or potentially scramble all the data on your drive. So, as a tip, treat SCSI devices and your ASR with the utmost respect, as it's an old device living in a modern world. Some tasks may require a little more patience than what you're accustomed to, so do yourself a favour and buy yourself an insurance policy, invest in a couple of spare SD cards, or whatever media you use, and back it up. Otherwise, you could end up in a data recovery centre throwing hundreds of dollars into a salvage job that may only return a percentage of the data on your drive. I'll leave some links in the description below of some suitable SD cards you can order from Amazon. Next, let's get into some of the common save commands that you'll probably need along the way. As mentioned earlier, unlike load having its own button, save commands are accessed via the command mode under their relative categories. For example, if I wanted to save the currently selected instrument indicated by the yellow selected LED, I'd hit the command mode followed by the instrument category. Then scroll till I find Save Instrument. Then hit Enter and give it a name. Followed by Enter again to execute the command. Similarly, if you wanted to save your sequences and song, then while in command mode, you could just hit Command, but this time the Sequence Song button, and scroll till you find the Save Song and All Sequences function, where again you could give it a name. And if you customized some effect parameters, or just wanted to save the bank effect variation you used in your song, then you could save your effects via command mode, then Effects button, and scroll till you find Save Bank Effect, and then Enter button to run that command. I might just point out that instrument effects, not to be confused with bank effects, don't have nor need a dedicated command, as they're saved when you save your instrument. If you've made any specific changes to the system settings, such as global pitch bend, foot switches, MIDI configuration, etc., then you can also save the state of your system parameters, again via the command mode, then System MIDI, and scroll till you find the Save Global Parameters function. Once you've saved all your various song components, such as instruments, sequences, effects, etc., then finish up by saving a bank file via command mode, Instrument Category button, and scroll to Save Bank, then hit Enter, where again you can provide a meaningful name, and enter again to execute the save. Saving a bank will make the loading process much easier to deal with, as the bank remembers not only which of these tracks your instruments were on, but also which disks they and any other components were saved to. So always remember to save the bank last. As a housekeeping suggestion, if your project starts modestly from humble beginnings, save your progress to a single disk or disk image per song. Then if you can no longer fit it on a floppy, then save your components to a specific directory on your SCSI device, such as sequences, instruments, effects, and system MIDI configuration. This requires a bit more storage space, but ensures any changes made to your instruments or relative components are exclusive to that particular song, rather than being a shared component relied upon by other songs that also use it. The shared scenario can be appealing as a means to maximize your storage efficiently, but it can go horribly wrong and potentially ruin other projects when a shared component is customized or updated to suit one song and not those that depend on it to remain unchanged. So consider those risks when saving your hard work or structuring new storage devices. If, for whatever reason, you attempt to save your work, but instead meet the dreaded not enough disk space notification, then you'll have to find another disk or disk image to continue saving the remainder. If you need to format a disk or copy your operating system to another disk, which I highly recommend, because if you lose your operating system, then that can prevent any more usage with the ASR until you get another. To format a disk, hit Command Mode, then System, and scroll till you find Format Floppy Disk, where you'll be able to enter in a name using the arrow keys or data entry slider. Then you'll be given a choice of either Ensoniq or computer. If you're using compatible software, choose computer, as it's possible to share files between the ASR and Mac or PCs running compatible software. But if you have no intention to use your disks with anything other than the ASR, then choose Ensoniq. And this will give you a tiny bit more storage space than the computer option. But either way, don't worry too much, as you can always reload your songs and save them off to another disk, formatted with the opposing option. In the case of formatting a SCSI drive, where you can choose the SCSI ID and provide a meaningful name, you'll be presented an option called interleave. To put this in the most basic of terms, this is kind of like a gearbox for data transmission. This negotiates the speed at which SCSI devices communicate. Some devices may be able to deliver data faster than the ASR can cope with. So certain interleave ratios allow time for the ASR to digest before it's sent more. Normally an interleave value of 0 or 1 will suffice, but if you like, you can experiment with higher ratios, like a 2 or a 4, but it really depends on the storage device you're using. So you can experiment with different values if you don't mind putting in the time to test and measure the time it takes saving and loading a large sample to see if you've found a faster gear for data transmission with a particular SCSI device. You may find some interleave values yield faster results than others, but just be careful, don't go formatting your main drive. But if you're unsure what to do, just leave it on the default value and hit enter to format. I'm not going to format my drive here, but you'll be asked about copying the operating system, which I highly advise you do. Just have the operating system disk handy, as the ASR will request it. Once you've formatted a SCSI drive, then you'll find it's been populated with some default directories, aka folders. For example, songs, sounds, banks, etc. And from this point, you're good to go. But since I've got the individual elements of my song all saved, I could quite easily hit load, then either instrument to browse and load the instrument I saved earlier by pressing enter. Or as we're still in the flashing load mode, indicated here, I could just hit the sequence song button and load my sequences back up again by pressing enter. Or if load is still flashing, I could hit the effects button and load the bank effect I saved earlier. I could also load my system MIDI parameters, but strangely enough, this load command is under the command mode system category. Alternatively, I could power down the ASR, come back tomorrow, and again via the load mode, hit the instrument button, and through this view also load banks. If you've created directories that you'd like to save something into, use the load button followed by system MIDI category to scroll through and change directories. Once your directory has been changed, you can then browse the files in that directory, and once you've exhausted the list of contents, you'll find the exit option via the load mode system category to return to the parent directory. If you need to find an instrument, song, effect, or any other category of file in the newly changed directory, again, just select a different category and return to the system MIDI category to navigate away to other directories or back to the root of your storage device. What I might add is that if you're unsure how much memory you have to load in other instruments, sequences, effects, etc., then you can visit the Edit Mode System MIDI category and scroll till you find free system blocks. There's also a free disk blocks read available under this category too. So finally, I'll just touch on macros. Macros, which you might generally use with SCSI storage devices, are basically shortcuts for directory or file locations, which come in handy if you've got frequently used directories buried deep within your directory structure. So rather than navigate down several folders, you can hold up to 28 locations of files and/or directories inside a single macro file. Potentially, if you had a few SCSI drives attached, you could easily access a folder on another drive by running one of these macros. For example, if I were to browse down a couple of directories deep on my hard drive, I could execute the reserved system macro, 0, which will return me to the directory of where my macro file resides, in this case, in the root of my hard drive. I thought macros deserve their own mini tutorial, so I've created a quick tip for macros over on the ToneLab Quick Tips channel, which I'll leave the link for below. So check that out, as they're very handy. For those unsure what the fuss is with the various operating systems, the most recent operating systems were feature-rich and relatively stable, but then depending on the features you need most, you might find the most recent operating system a little bloated. Earlier operating systems, prior to version 2, don't come with a full suite of functions, such as the 44K effects, nor the hard disk recording, and as a result are much more lean than, say, operating system version 3.53. This might become obvious to some when getting around the sequencer. So if you like things simple and lo-fi, then you could be content with operating system version 1.61, which you can look up in downloadable image form from the Ensoniq Users Group forum on Facebook. And that's also something you may want to consider when formatting your SCSI storage device. I've put some additional resources in the description below. In the meantime, check out the sample pack store via tonelab.au. For those after more ASR tips, check out the Quick Tips channel over at ToneLab QT. Then those on Instagram, feel free to drop by for a look at ToneLab. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and ding the bell so you don't miss out on future episodes. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.